Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un agreed to bolster ties between the two countries. Putin is on a visit to North Korea, first time in 24 years.
Right, Haim. This is the second meeting between the two leaders since September, and experts say it is largely driven by Russia's need for weapons as its war with Ukraine continues. North Korea says that the meeting between the two leaders demonstrates invincibility and durability of friendship and unity. Pyongyang called the country's partnership an engine for accelerating the building of a new multipolar world. The Pentagon voiced concerns about the growing ties between Moscow and Pyongyang.
The deepening cooperation between Russia and the DPRK is something that should be of concern, especially to anyone that's interested in maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, but also supporting the people of Ukraine as they continue to fight against Russian aggression.
Now, on the other hand, NATO underscored that Russia's war in Ukraine was being propped up by North Korea along with China and Iran. NATO Chief Stoltenberg said that the countries together wanted to see the Western alliance fail. Also, Stoltenberg warned against the potential support that Russia provides to North Korea when it comes to the missiles and nuclear programs.
Meanwhile, Wednesday's agenda includes one-on-one discussions between Putin and Kim Jong-un, a gala concert, state reception, honor guards, document signing, and a statement to the media.
All right, to discuss things further, we're now being joined by Professor Peter Kuznick, Professor of History and Director of Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on World DNA.
Glad to be with you.
Sir, of course, North Korea and Russia are both heavily sanctioned by the West. In recent times, they've vowed strong ties. Anti-West alignment, that is something that is deepening here. This has raised, and the United States has raised alarm over the same as well. How do you think the West views this visit, and what are the challenges that it perceives?
Well, clearly, in the context of what's happening internationally now, this visit is very, very significant. We've seen a series of meetings recently. There was the so-called Peace Summit in Switzerland, and that was a failure. 160 countries were invited. Only 98 attended, and of those 98, 20, including India, refused to sign the communique at the end of the summit. So that didn't achieve anything. There was a meeting of the G7 that just took place in Italy. And that was also a lot of show and symbolism, but didn't really achieve very much. You have leaders there, almost all of whom are very, very weak, some of whom are on the way out and face serious challenges. Then you had NATO meetings in which they talked about increasing the number of deployed nuclear warheads. So this is all going on at the time that the situation in Ukraine is getting more and more intense, especially with the new levels of weaponry going in there, and then the authorization by the US and others that Ukraine can use some of their weapons to strike inside of Russia. So the tensions are heightening, and North Korea has been providing Russia with very significant military aid. Russia already is outproducing NATO when it comes to artillery, and the Russians are deploying many times as much artillery, but the South Koreans estimate that North Korea provided 5 million artillery shells last year. And so that Putin wants that military aid. He wants the intercontinental ballistic missiles, and North Korea wants a lot of Russian military technological know-how, as well as Russian wheat exports. So it's a kind of symbiotic relationship at a time when neither country has got a lot of allies on the world scene, but the United States influence is not what it used to be either. And so we've got the global South resisting the United States and growing ties between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran.
Right, Mr. Kuznik, you very well covered all the parameters here of the ties between North Korea and Russia. And like you mentioned, North Korea is providing military aid to Russia, according to reports. In return, in exchange, Putin will help Kim with spy satellites, like you mentioned. How do you assess this transactional relationship, or can we say friendship, between Moscow and Pyongyang at this point of time? And what perhaps can the West do to stop all of this, with most of the missiles and weapons going via train?
Russia has been instrumental in supporting United Nations efforts to sanction North Korea in the past. But beginning in March, Russia vetoed a very important United Nations mission to look into the sanctions about North Korea's military policies and their missile tests. And so without Russia's support, the United Nations is going to be greatly weakened in that regard. So what we're seeing now is very, very dangerous, in my opinion. We're seeing greater and greater polarization. Russia gets much closer to China, to North Korea, to Iran, and others. And while the United States, which used to be able to call the shots internationally, is in an increasingly weakened position, with the possibility, frightening as it is to me, that Donald Trump might be the next president. And if that happens, then America's alliances, not only NATO, but with the Europeans, and America's support for Ukraine could certainly be or ended. So, there's a lot of moving parts right now, and a lot of uncertainty. And rather than move toward a multipolar world, we're going toward a bipolar world, which is not the same thing.
Right, sir. In fact, absolutely. I wanted better understanding on this, coming back to a point that you made earlier. Now, I want to understand, what does this visit mean for Ukraine? As you mentioned, this comes after a failed Swiss peace conference, of course, the G7 summit, which saw no concrete results either. Do you think this visit is a chance for Russia to perhaps show that it's not isolated anymore?
Well, we know that the Western sanctions against Russia have not worked, partly because China and India have been buying up Russian oil that the Europeans used to get, which is hurting the European economies because they're paying more for their oil. So the growth rate in Europe is lower than the growth rate in Russia right now. So we see that happening. In terms of Ukraine, Russia already is gaining the advantage on the battlefield. Since they opened up the new front in northeast around Kharkiv, Ukraine has had to move a lot of its troops from the south and the east. And especially in the east, Russia's been able to make more and more slow incremental gains. There are more weapon systems coming into Ukraine, including F-16s, and that might help Ukraine, but that's the fantasy, is that somehow Ukraine is going to be able to turn the tide of the war. I don't see it happening. Russia is just too strong. They've got too much armaments, and they've got too big a population. And so the fear that everybody has right now is we're moving closer and closer to a military confrontation between Russia and NATO, or Russia and China and NATO, which could mean World War III. We need diplomacy. As Guterres and others have been saying, this fighting is not going to solve anything. We need to sit down and start talking.
All right. Well, Professor Kuznik, thank you so much for joining us on World DNA with your insights on this.
Thank you for having me.